Welcome back to the Caregiver Minute, where every weekday family and professional caregivers gather to refine their skills, gain inspiration, and prepare to serve. One of the most challenging forms of dementia to help anyone through is alcohol-induced dementia. This is especially tragic because it's preventable. When someone drinks high levels of alcohol for a long period of time, it tends to deplete the B vitamin known as thiamine. And when that occurs, certain parts of the brain become dysfunctional, and a person basically ends up with more memory than they have sense. They lose reasoning and judgment and planning. And they do often have some memory impairment, but I took care of a man named Tom years ago who always remembered my name. And he remembered phone numbers, and he remembered lots of details about things that had occurred. But he didn't think about the fact that he frequently fell, which is another symptom of alcohol-induced dementia. Think about how someone is when they're drunk. They stagger around, and they're definitely a fall risk. When you have dementia related to chronic alcohol use, you kind of stagger around like a drunk, and you're much more prone to falling. Well, Tom would get up impulsively. He'd get an idea that he needed to do something, and he would stand, and then he would fall, and then he would remember, oh, yeah, I tend to fall. I probably shouldn't be standing up. So people with this form of dementia get very impulsive. I learned an important lesson while working with Tom that's applicable in a lot of different situations, so I wanted to share it with you today. Tom was absolutely convinced that he had to get back to Rapid City, South Dakota, because he had a bunch of farmland there, and it was his responsibility to work that land. And no amount of logic or reasoning or pointing out that he was wheelchair-bound and he couldn't even get up on a tractor would make sense to him. That's not how his brain worked. And his memory for some things was pretty decent. He remembered exactly where he wanted to get to, he could describe the farm perfectly, and he remembered the phone number for one of the local cab companies in Idaho. So he'd come to my office on an almost daily basis and announce that he needed to call this cab company, and here's the number, and would you please dial? Well, he'd call the cab company, and he would announce to them that he needed to go to Rapid City, and he'd start trying to arrange a cab. Well, obviously, he wasn't in a position to leave, and his brother, who was a legal guardian for him, did not want him getting in the cab and going, and it wasn't reasonable for him to do so. It was not a safe situation. So how do we deal with that? Well, I've often described serving people with dementia as kind of like being on stage in a perpetual improv act. It's very theatrical. And when we're talking behind the scenes, it's kind of like a production meeting before we get on stage to talk about how to create conditions that feel normal and natural to people. If you've ever seen the film The Truman Show, starring Jim Carrey, where he grows up on a soundstage that's decorated to look like a town, and he has no idea that he's the star of a reality TV show, and that all the people around him, even his parents and siblings, are actors and actresses, and they're just trying to create this illusory experience that feels real to Truman, so that the rest of the world can watch his life unfold in front of them. And Truman starts to get a hint here and there that things are not happening in a normal way, and maybe this is all an illusion. When we get together at times like this here on the Caregiver Minute to talk about strategies, it's almost like we're working behind the scenes so that we can get back on stage and create situations that feel as normal as possible to the people that we're serving. Well, when Tom wasn't around, I called the cab company and I explained to them exactly what was going on with his situation. And I recommended that when Tom called, they simply needed to go with the illusion a little bit, but give a plausible reason why they couldn't pick him up that day. They needed to say something like, I am so sorry, Tom. All of our cabs are out on calls right now, and that's a really long distance. It's probably going to be a few days before we can get someone to take you to South Dakota. And he'd say, okay, that's fine. And he'd hang up the phone and he'd turn to me and he'd say, well, they can't take me today. I guess I'll try back in a couple of days. And he would calm down and everything would be fine for the rest of that day. That went a lot better than trying to convince him that there was no way that he could go to South Dakota, or that his brother, who was his guardian, didn't want him to go, or anything else that was particularly logical. So sometimes our effort to create the illusion of control needs to inform other people. It was important that I not thwart Tom with his desire to call, and he had a right to make a phone call. So I didn't want to intervene any more than I absolutely had to. But the cab company needed to understand what was going on. They needed to have some notes in their software so that whatever dispatcher picked up the phone was aware of the situation and they could do what was most helpful to Tom. Not shut him down, not say no, but to essentially delay things a little bit. That went on for as long as Tom was in our building, and it was much more effective than trying to thwart him at every turn. So the key takeaway here is that sometimes in our efforts to create the illusion of control and to make things feel like they're unfolding in as normal and natural a way as possible, we have to enlist the aid of others. We need to make sure that they understand how the people that we're serving see the world that they're in, and they can help co-create that world. Kind of like the production team for The Truman Show, behind the scenes, making it all come together in as seamless a way as possible. I hope that's helpful to you and the people you serve, and I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow for another episode of the Caregiver Minute.